Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Hello, and welcome back. Today we're going to continue our introduction to the various colonies that comprised the New England region. We started with Plymouth Colony last episode, and they were not the first English attempt at permanent colonization in the New England region, but they were the first ones to make it. They were true separatists that had benefited from a decade of incubation in Holland, where they learned some of the administrative and skilled trades that they would need in the New World. And their timing was also perfectly aligned with the needs of Edwin Sandys of the Virginia Company of London and Ferdinando Gorges from the Council for New England. And they settled north of their intended area. And they formed a new charter guaranteeing cooperation amongst themselves and ultimately arrived at Plymouth Rock and settled just as winter set in. And through many hardships and deaths within the group, they survived the winter. And by the spring of 1621, things were looking up, and the folks of Plymouth were well on their way. Well, this episode today is actually going to be part one of at least 2 episodes. But the second part is going to be a while in coming. We're going to have a few episodes in between. What we want to do today is introduce the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a colony that will become the most influential colony in New England. And it's our second consideration among this cluster of colonies up in the New England area. And so it was in 1628, the Massachusetts Bay Company received a charter as a joint stock company. Contrary to the Plymouth Colony, whose main goal was religious liberty, this was a venture intended for making money. Investors included some from the defunct Dorchester Company, which had been a part of a failed venture before. The Massachusetts Bay Company assumed their claims upon receiving their charter. The land grant was secured by the Council of New England, the successor to the Virginia Company of Plymouth, and it included the area between the Charles and the Merrimack Rivers. Now, Massachusetts Bay Colony geographically was north and west of Plymouth Bay. The area had been home to several Algonquin-speaking tribes, the Massachusetts, the Nausets, the Wampanoags. There were Pennacooks on the Merrimack River, and out west, the Nipmucks and the Puckamtucks and the Mohicans. Now, the Mohawk tribe out of New York State had subjugated some of these people, which would be an aid to the colonists later. Their populations had also been hit hard by diseases that they had acquired through interactions with the Europeans already. So this made settlement for the colonials a lot easier. And the area had been chartered first by the French, but James I of England apparently didn't care. He made provision for the 2 English colonies in 1606, and these were both joint stock companies for profit. And their territories were going to overlap with investors primarily from London and Plymouth in England. So the London Company settled in Jamestown, but farther north, the Plymouth Company established Sagadahoc Colony in Maine in 1607. That only lasted a year. But as we discussed previously, the English presence and persistence was there to stay. They would fish the waters and trade with the local natives and sometimes even abuse them. You remember, Plymouth came along in 1620. So a couple of years later, 3 years to be exact, in 1623, and then in 1624, Weymouth Colony and then Thomas Weston's Wessagosset Colony came about, and those failed. 1623 also saw the settlement of Cape Ann. This was a Puritan endeavor near the Plymouth Colony, and it was settled by the Plymouth Council for New England as a small fishing village, but it dissolved 2 years later in 1625. Now, it would be resettled again in 1628. In 1626, Roger Conant and a group from the Cape Ann settlement settled Namkaeg, which was later going to be named Salem. And he also settled the communities of Peabody and Danvers. Now, you don't have to remember all of these names and all of these dates. I've said all of this again to demonstrate that colonization was not easy. It failed a lot, and it makes the successes that much more impressive. I think a lot of times we forget that these other colonies and settlements existed. So back to the Massachusetts Bay. They were granted the charter in 1628, but the following year in 1629, there was an organizational change. And under the Cambridge Agreement, the various parties involved with the Massachusetts Bay Colony agreed to migrate to the colony and to assume full responsibility. Oftentimes in these days, those who invested in a particular colony never actually physically visited the colony. They invested for money. So when it came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, those that were unwilling to relocate sold their shares. And the beneficiaries were overwhelmingly Puritan. So the original trading company, organized for profits, now had a religious agenda as well. They wanted a theocracy, not a democracy. And their footprint was significantly larger than Plymouth's, both in numbers and influence. Now, these were not poor immigrant-type folks from Leyden, but in fact, these were wealthy Englishmen with means and the home country population to solicit, as well as the larger Puritan population still in England to attract for future colonists. In 1630, Governor John Winthrop delivered between 700 and 1,000 colonists to Massachusetts Bay. Winthrop was one of the primary personalities of the early colony. He served as governor for 12 years. Winthrop was an educated man. He was a very skilled administrator. It was at this time that he delivered his famous City Upon a Hill sermon. I mean, it's almost prophetic in his delivery. The world would certainly be watching what they were doing, and they still are. Now, along the way, mistakes happened, but so did unprecedented success. This original group that we're talking about here bypassed Salem and settled on the Shawmut Peninsula of Massachusetts Bay. This would later become Boston. The initial losses were substantial. 200 people died the first year, and an additional 200 people lost their nerve and returned home to England. But that exodus did not last. Over the next decade, roughly 20,000 immigrants arrived, mostly English Puritans. Now think about that number, 20,000 immigrants arriving in a decade. And as we think about that, let's review very quickly a quote that I read on our last episode. It's a quote that I read from David Freeman Hawke. And what he was talking about was the King of England beginning to ask the question about all of these people leaving the country. And so Hawke wrote, I quote, "But the mayor and others only sought to reassure the crown that it lost to America people of no importance. Some did come against their will, criminals given the choice of death or immigration, vagrants, orphan children, paupers, those judged lewd and dangerous, and of course, enchained blacks. But the bulk of immigrants came voluntarily, and more often than not, they were the most, quote, vivid people, unquote, of England. Those with energy and courage enough to make a new start in life. The undernourished poor, sapped physically and psychologically, seldom ventured overseas except under duress. Most of those who emigrated were from what would be called today the middle and lower middle classes. Farmers, shopkeepers, artisans, and yes, lively, saucy young women in search of husbands. Perhaps there is truth in the remark of a contemporary that, quote, God sifted a whole nation that he might bring choice grain over into this wilderness, end quote. Along with the masses, there were some big names arriving, influential men. Puritan ministers like John Cotton, perhaps the most gifted theologian of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, another of the refugees from the English persecution, a man whose progeny eclipsed even his own reputation. He was, after all, the grandfather of Cotton Mather, a most distinguished man in his own right. Now, Cotton Mather eclipsed not just his grandfather, John Cotton, but his father as well. Increase Mather had been the president of Harvard. And Cotton Mather was a renowned theologian. He was an author, a historian. He was invoked in plant hybridization, promoted inoculations to fight diseases like smallpox. He was an elected fellow at the Royal Society of London, a group which Cotton submitted several scientific reports to. He was in many ways a real Renaissance man. He's not without controversy or critics, however. In my opinion, he was preoccupied with witchcraft and the supernatural. I mean, it's not unusual in his day, but when you couple that with his reputation, he was very influential in several situations. He was in large part responsible for the execution of a Catholic woman, Goody Glover. And he wrote a book called Memorable Providences, chronicling the strange situation amongst the children of the Goodwin family of Boston just a few years before the Salem witch trials. And he was there. He could have been far more an instrument for restraint than he was. Without drawing the situation out here, his activity at Salem kind of disappoints me. I mean, this was a time when there were few regional men of influence. New England was very congregational in mindset. You know, you didn't have a lot of influence outside of your own community. But Cotton Mather was one of those men that did. And he could have and he should have done more. So one of his primary rivals, a contemporary named Robert Calif of Boston, blamed his book, Memorable Providences, at least in part on the disaster and the tragedy that occurred at Salem. But history's loaded with accomplished men that erred, sometimes horrifically. And we're going to develop some of the backstory to Salem in a later episode because there's more there than we're usually led to believe. And the backstory fascinates me. It may not justify what happened, but it serves to maybe explain or at least to put into context such an ugly chapter in American history. So I just wanted to say that. I wanted to recognize that Cotton Mather, he is a controversial figure, but if you're putting yourself back in the 17th century Massachusetts Bay Colony, this is a man of distinction. And among some of the other men that are worthy of mention here are guys like Roger Williams. Now, he had been an influential man in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He'd even acted as an intercessor with the natives for a time. But he was not such a hardliner and was ultimately a dissenter of the Puritan colony. So he founded Rhode Island and Providence Plantation. And in 1643, Williams sought his own charter for his own colony. And this was seen as basically competition for the Puritan colonies. So this action served as yet another reason for the United Colonies, or the New England Confederation, which bound the colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven together for mutual security and support. Now remember, we referenced this previously. This was a pact between the Puritan colonies of New England, and they left a bunch of them out. And we're going to examine that more later in our storyline. Along this time, John Mason's New Hampshire was also coming of age. Remember, this was another one of the non-Puritan colonies. But lastly, for now, I think it's important to mention one more important figure in the New England of mid-17th century, Thomas Hooker. In 1639, his Hartford colony combined with Windsor and Wethersfield to form the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And again, this is a Puritan dissenting from the hardliners of Massachusetts Bay. The Connecticut region was really a series of townships and forts that had spread like tentacles from Massachusetts Bay. As the population grew, the demand for land did as well. Also, within a few years, there was already an independent streak that proved harder and harder to control. And Connecticut was a contested area. The Dutch were there for a while, along with their Pequot allies. New Netherlands also had claims there. So we're going to spend some time talking about the Connecticut area a little bit later because the story, I think, is one of the most underappreciated, in my opinion, of all of the New England landscape. Connecticut's fascinating. But this general Puritan English migration is worth considering from their perspective in their time. I mean, it's not just influential ministers or people in society. These ministers, oftentimes, they would bring their entire congregation with them. I mean, what does that do to the landscape of a population of a nation when whole communities simply pick up and leave? That's a lot of people power to lose. That's a lot of brain power, a lot of intellectual power, just a lot of know-how and a lot of ability, like worldliness, like just how to get things done in a rapid pace. We talk about term limits for politicians in American politics. And sometimes I think that sounds like a great idea. But the reality is sometimes that kind of scares me because it takes sometimes the old guys, the guys that have been there a while, to know how to get things done. I know that makes it sound cheap and dirty, but that's the reality. So think about the brainpower leaving England. These guys were all of one national mindset, right? So here's the spoiler alert on the backside of this. The English Civil War was coming in about 20 years. A couple of questions arise with that, and we will look at this from a purely colonial perspective in a few episodes. What would that have looked like in England, at the time of the Civil War, if all of these tens of thousands of Puritans had stayed in England? And secondly, how much easier was the settling of the New World when you had this many like-minded, motivated individuals focused in one particular area? These questions are not as theoretical as they seem. We're going to be able to actually explore these dynamics, as we proceed through our narrative. So the steady migration that would last a decade and see, again, 20,000 plus move to the Massachusetts Bay Colony ensured the success of this colony. I mean, again, these weren't poor folks from Leiden. These were artisans, these were professionals and Puritans. And you've got to understand the whole of the native population was estimated at about 7,000 in 1620. And these 7,000 natives, they weren't united. As a matter of fact, as we'll see, oftentimes they were bitterly divided amongst themselves. And they also aligned themselves with various European communities as they struggled with one another. I mean, talk about a population migration just overrun, complete chaos. This alone would obviously number the days of the natives. So as the population gained its footing, it expanded. Opportunities presented themselves beyond an Englishman's wildest dreams, with very little concern for those that were already here. So with all this migration, the area and the settlements grew rapidly. All classes were welcomed, and the environment helped to kind of level the playing field between the classes. I mean, after all, these folks needed each other. And one marked difference here in Massachusetts Bay from the other colonies, and one that did help them to move kind of in lockstep. I mean, dictatorships are a lot cleaner than democracies. I didn't say they're better to live in. I didn't say I want to live in one, but they are a lot cleaner. Like you make a decision and everybody moves in the direction that they're told to. So Massachusetts Bay was a little bit different than the other colonies. First of all, the folks that were invested there lived there. But second of all, there was a requirement for becoming a stockholder and a voter or a freeman inside of the colony. It was church membership. It wasn't land ownership. So these folks thought the same. As historian Paul Johnson so succinctly stated, the Puritans were good at colonization from the vantage of an ability to simply survive and thrive as a group. And that they did. They created a strict doctrinal theocracy. It's a tough society. I mean, your behavior was monitored. They weren't very tolerant. The irony is that they escaped an atmosphere that was becoming increasingly intolerant to them, only to jump across the pond, so to speak, and create an atmosphere intolerant of others. Baptists, Quakers, Anglicans, even dissenting Puritans, as we've already mentioned, need not apply. Remnants of this culture persisted hundreds of years later. It shows the vitality that they brought to this colony. Through many incarnations, organizations, and reorganizations, including the establishment of the Constitution of the United States of America, the second federal government of these United States. One example is quite famous, if not misunderstood, in our current organized government. In 1801 and 1802, there was an exchange of letters between President Thomas Jefferson and the Danbury Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut. The Baptists were a minority of the population and were subject to laws passed, motivated by religious conviction of the majority Congregationalists, the Puritans. So the Baptists expressed concern over the Connecticut state constitution that lacked explicit protection of religious liberty and protection from government establishment of religion. You get that? So the Baptists are a minority group in Connecticut, and they suddenly became alarmed at some of the laws that were being passed that favored a congregationalist view of the world. Like, let's say if one Christian group in the majority passed laws limiting or forbidding business on the Sabbath, while another Christian group in the minority did not hold to Sabbatarian views, right? I mean, so the Baptists were looking for federal intervention or at least clarification on the First Amendment or the Establishment Clause. To this, Thomas Jefferson responded, and I'm going to quote here from billofrightsinstitute.org. Thomas Jefferson responded by, part of this is me inputting, and then there's a quote here. So Jefferson responded by me presumably shedding some light on his beliefs about federalism and the meaning of the Establishment Clause. This is Thomas Jefferson, don't forget. So Jefferson did not address the subject of state-sponsored churches, but he assured the congregation that the federal government could not interfere with their church or offer special favors to any particular sect. Jefferson wrote, quote, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole of the American people, which declared that their legislature should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," end quote, thus building a wall between church and state, end quote. This phrase has become so popular that many people believe it's actually in our Constitution. It is not. One thing I will say, I have read that same quote where he says there appears to be a wall of separation between church and state, but we get the concept from the letter. I mean, it seems to indicate that Thomas Jefferson himself was elucidating the original intent of the First Amendment. He seems to be saying that the minority Baptist community in Connecticut may have to suffer through the local majority Congregationalist laws. Because to intervene, Jefferson is saying, would give the impression of siding with the minority Baptists. You catch that? Disenfranchising the majority, if I can use a contemporary word. It appears that we often hear and apply this the exact opposite way of Jefferson's intended response. The Baptists said, we're a minority and the religious majority in our area are passing laws they're comfortable with and we are not. And Jefferson basically said, I cannot show favoritism towards you. The fact is they've passed those laws. They're the majority census in your area. You're stuck with it. Now, in Jefferson's defense, and possibly to diffuse a needless angst right here in the middle of this narrative, it can be argued that Jefferson did not write the letter intending to set some type of legal precedent. I don't think that he did, actually, but rather to garner support from the local majority. But at any rate, Jefferson responded to a minority religious group in Connecticut by telling them basically they would have to be subject to the majority religious group. That's a big subject, I know. And I only want to reference this here as an indicator of the far-reaching effect of this Puritan society. And as we eventually work our way through the founding of the current organized government, we'll take some time to more slowly and carefully kind of consider this particular situation with a little more detail. But I want to add to this also many of Nathaniel Hawthorne's works. And again, we're talking about the influence of Puritan society. Hawthorne lived, 200 years later, a few generations removed. But his works were motivated by the atmosphere created by the Puritan theocracy, or the Puritan oligarchy, as many have called it, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I just wanted to note a few. The Scarlet Letter in dealing with religious legalism and sin and guilt. Young Goodman Brown and the hypocrisy of Puritan society. And the House of Seven Gables dealing with, among other things, the curse of greed and of the taking of one's land by force or trickery, if need be, and the possible consequences, if nothing else, creating a moral dilemma. So in consideration of the New England Puritan society of which Hawthorne was a descendant, there's a lot to consider as they settled, as they conquered and wrested the land from other people groups. Now, don't misunderstand me. I love Hawthorne. My contention with these works, and these are some of my favorite works, by the way, my contention with these works is not his observation, My contention is that he seems to indicate somehow, in his opinion, that these realities were or are unique to the American experience. I believe that he was overly critical of the Puritans. I mean, it's easy to do from a distance and within the society with which we live, right? We're critiquing ourselves. But what Hawthorne was illuminating was more a universal human or societal nature. I think it's disingenuous to ignore that reality of how our culture evolved. I mean, let alone, it's less than helpful if the goal is to actually learn from history. But it's equally misguided to present the history as if colonial America was a whole lot more different than other cultures. I mean, keep in mind, we have to judge these folks by the world that they lived in, not ours. Theirs was a violent world where religious differences and toleration were serious threats to public order. Nationalities and cultures did not always mix well, and diplomacy was not always the goal. And we are still today beneficiaries of this rigid society, both in what they accomplished, but also, ironically enough, in what other people accomplished because of them. You know, people who ultimately left the Massachusetts Bay Colony or the umbrella of Puritan colonies with the organizational blueprint for society without that strict religious code. I mean, I love Hawthorne. I really enjoy reading him. But I feel sometimes his observations are far more universal than he portrayed them. But we're going to let this story in the New England colonial atmosphere play itself out. I also want to say, this is a bit of a sidebar. If you don't like sidebars, skip ahead a few minutes. But there's a reason that I almost seem to beat a dead horse on the subject of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And if you'll allow me to digress for a minute, I'll tell you a story. I attended a few conferences on the Puritans years ago. You know, over the course of a couple of years, there was a particular gentleman that would come around and give lectures on the Puritans, and he would preach some sermons. He was an interesting guy, extremely intelligent, very well versed. He had a lot of books. I bought a lot of his books. I still have a lot of his books, and I read them from time to time. These Puritans were brilliant men. I mean, it's too bad that our contemporary society doesn't seem to enjoy the art of thinking anymore. We like amusement. We like predigested thoughts. I mean, usually our predigested thoughts, our favorite ones, are the ones that we already agree with, right? I mean, no offense, but that seems to be true. So when we hear like somebody was a Puritan from long ago, we kind of wrinkle our noses. But I just wonder how many people have actually read Puritan literature. It's fascinating. So anyways, one day after one of this guy's lectures on the glory of Puritanism, a society that I do greatly admire, but I would never want to live in, I asked him his opinion on Nathaniel Hawthorne. It wasn't good. So I pressed him on the universal nature of Hawthorne's observations. I mean, this guy was usually cool and calm and collected. He got all red in the face and huffed out of the lobby. There were a lot of people standing there. We're all just kind of stunned, you know? I mean, I wasn't trying to provoke the guy. I just wanted to understand his position on Nathaniel Hawthorne. I mean, you know, the question is, can we admire the Puritans and recognize the value of a Nathaniel Hawthorne? In his case, I guess not. So anyways, you know, he storms out, he pushes his way out the door, and after about 10 seconds of storming out the door, as we all kind of stood there amazed, I mean, we were kind of chuckling. I thought it was funny. He came flying back in, and I mean, he got in my face, yelling about Hawthorne and how he was of Puritan lineage and how he had changed his name to disassociate himself from that heritage and, you know, this, that, and the other thing. And I mean, that was a great lesson for me, personally. I admired that guy, and I still do. He was a lot smarter than me, a lot more accomplished, but unfortunately, and this is another tendency, it's human nature, it seems he was more interested in defending his quote-unquote people than really examining the history and learning. I mean, practicing the art of extrapolating wisdom for future use. There's really no better tutor than history for the able and the willing-minded. My views have changed over the years by reading and listening, but also thinking a lot. The older I get, the more I think. So I want to develop this narrative. Now, back to the storyline. I want to develop this narrative with sobriety because of those things that I just talked about. I admire the colonials. I admire the Puritans whose greatest sin might just have been that they emerged the victors in a very hostile environment where every side has much to teach and celebrate, but also shares a responsibility in what actually happened. I mean, I've said it before, I know in the previous series, and I'll probably say it again 100 times, but there's no people group that currently occupies a territory that wasn't once somebody else's, right? I mean, territory isn't generally yielded voluntarily. So in that sense, everybody's guilty of theft somehow, no matter how far back you go, right? So building appreciation in successful societies can require adapting the positives while recognizing and adjusting the negatives. Does that make sense, right? I mean, if you're a student of history, you don't got to be mad at a guy from 400 years ago. I would also say this when it comes to the Puritans and the development of the New England colonies. Just like the rest of the world, universally speaking as well, if you cannot maintain cultural identity markers, you run the risk of balkanization. And just like pure democracies, this is not an outcome that easily bears good fruit. So as I was saying, they created a strict doctrinal theocracy. It's a tough society. I mean, behavior was monitored. They weren't very tolerant. And again, the irony is that they escaped an atmosphere that was becoming increasingly intolerant to them. And then they go and duplicate and create an atmosphere intolerant of others. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, however, was the colony for decades. The colony. Geographically, it was made up of land from today's Massachusetts and Maine, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. And as they succeeded, they expanded. And that's when trouble came. Firstly, we'll look at the Pequot Wars, the next few episodes. We'll look at King Philip's War, which came a little while later. And in the midst of that, the third thing that we want to look at was that there were tremendous commercial gains, which led in time to the Navigation Acts. You remember we talked about those before, those pesky laws that were passed by Parliament in England, thousands of miles away across the ocean, to curtail the Puritan trade to England's advantage. I mean, these guys were, after all, colonies. And again, we covered this already when we discussed the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. We're going to cover it again in a few episodes from a little different angle, but just as a reminder, from the Crown's point of view, any colonial success should always benefit the mother country first. And with each new generation of colonials born, there was an increasing expectation for their own independence and sovereignty, their own ability to make money. I mean, they were English subjects, but they also had never been to the homeland. So their affinities, their lives were in North America. Their interests were in North America. Their fortunes were in North America. And through it all, Massachusetts Bay Colony was a cultural and a financial success. They traded with England and the West Indies. They established a mint in 1652 to deal with the shortage of hard currency. I mean, wait a minute, you might say, how could they do that? Expediency, need, regional dominance. And there were other ways to offset the shortage of hard currency as well, and we're going to address those very soon. As the decades passed, instability at home in England brought many changes organizationally to the colony, but progress continued until 1691 when a new charter was issued renaming the colony the province of Massachusetts Bay. It was then that the Plymouth Colony, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard were absorbed into Massachusetts. And there's a lot more that we could talk about with Massachusetts Bay, but I think we've laid a good foundation for where we want to go and where we're going to end up with this. We'll cover a lot more of the narrative in the coming episodes. The problems with the natives, the problems with the neighboring colonies, the problems with England. But for now, I really hope that this brief overview of the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony has helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.